The Springs Branch Railway opened on the 31st of October 1838. Originally, the line was to terminate just prior to the Wigan to Aspel Road at New Springs, but later there was also a connection from this point across the Wigan Road, firstly to the workshops that were later to be the sawmills, and then further on to the Earl of Crawford's mineral line near Shedfield Bridge. The order to build the first shed at Springs Branch was made at the end of 1858. After consistent expansion, by 1904 Springs Branch Shed had 16 roads of 250 feet, with room for 80 engines. By the 1960s it was the oldest steam motive power shed still operating. On the 4th of December 1967 it closed for steam after almost 110 years of service. Before we move off, let's quickly look back across the main line to the Innsmouth colliery. There were eventually 6 pits on this site. Number 1 and 2 closed in the 1920s, with the last pit closing in 1962. Right, now let's hop on for the ride at Springs Branch Junction, past Ince and up to Top Place and around to New Springs and then down to the extension to the Alexandra and Lindsay pits. On the way I will attempt to point out some of the sights and places. The first bridge we come to carries the Warrington Road over the line. Whilst the original bridge still exists today, it was infilled in March 2005 in order to allow a 7.5 ton weight restriction to be lifted. As we approach the bridge, to our right is the no longer standing St Mary's Church, built in 1887 and demolished in 1978 due to mining subsidence. To the right after the bridge we find the first of a number of wagon works to line the route. Looking back we can see to the right of the bridge the old coaching inn, which still stands. The approaching embankment and bridge is the former Lancashire and Yorkshire Wigan avoiding line, the Pemberton Loop. It carried coal trains and passenger trains from Manchester to Liverpool and was built to bypass Wigan Moorgate Station, and originally opened to make travelling from Manchester to Liverpool quicker, allowing something like a 40-minute Liverpool to Manchester express and goods trains. The line opened around 1889, closed in 1969 and was lifted in 1971. Before we pass under the bridge, let's look at the then and now map. You can see just after the Pemberton Loop passes over us, we also quickly cross the Wigan Junction Railway, which was extended to Wigan in 1884. It was built to link the coalfields around Wigan with the Cheshire Line Committee line at Glazebrook. The station of Lower Ince can be seen in the distance, which was on the line from Wigan Central to Glazebrook. Closed in 1964, today there is very little left of the station site, and in fact the deep cutting up to what was the station has been back infilled and is just an extensive green space. Immediately after the bridge is Ince Wagon Works, quickly followed by what was Church Ironworks. Today, those living at the end of Christopher Street are sat on top of Church Ironworks, while Spindlewood Road sits directly on the Wagon Works. Passing to the right is Ince Forge, which today is the site of the Wigan Enterprise Park. As we pass Ince Forge, we see ahead another embankment carrying a line. This was what was originally built as the Manchester and Southport Railway and opened in 1885. The line is still in use and operated today by Northern Rail, passing through Ince and Wigan Moorgate stations to the west of us. Passing under the bridge, we now approach the Central Wagon Works, which was a very large complex lining each side of the tracks. Why so many wagon works? These wagon works and the others on the line built and maintained all the wagons for the coal and steel industry, with the Wigan Coal Corporation at its peak possessing over 11,000 wagons in total. As we steam on, today with the wagon works long gone, we are travelling directly through the Dobson Park Industrial Estate and onto our first road crossing on the Manchester Road. In the background you can see our first glimpse of the Steelworks chimneys. As we pass over the Manchester Road crossing, immediately to our left is the Ince Hall East Pit Colliery. Today Ironside Avenue sits on this pit, so anyone living there, don't dig too deep. On the left behind you see the approaching Rabbit Rocks. Or are they the Rockies? Before we get to the next crossing, on our right is another colliery, the Industrious Bee Colliery. Before closing around 1939, it was employing around 57 people below and 30 above. Continuing the long climb, we approach the Bell Green Lane crossing. This spot today is just between West Street and Nelson Street on the existing Bell Green Lane and is completely unrecognisable. After the crossing, and now looking left, we can see in the distance the Rosebridge Colliery. At one time employing over 700 people, this site is now just a wood at the end of Edinburgh Close. The embankment in front of us carries the Welly Loop line. Built by the Lancashire Union Railway, the Welly Loop, which bypassed Wigan to the east, opened in 1869 mainly for freight, closing finally in 1970. Before we pass under the bridge, let's look at the then and now map and take a look at the footprint of the huge Kirkless iron and steel works that existed up until 1930. Much of this area today is a nature reserve. Passing under the Welly Loop, we enter a deep cutting approaching Kirkless Junction and running alongside the vast Kirkless iron and steel works and further on a coke works. To our right, we make out the chimneys of what were tar plants and flag works, utilising the byproducts from the various processes. In Grace's Guide to British Industrial History, it states that in 1873 the steelworks included 10 blast furnaces 60 feet high and 5 furnaces 80 feet high. The weekly make of each of the larger furnaces is about 350 tons and of the smaller about 300 tons. By 1914 the Wigan Coal and Iron Company were employing something like 11,000 people. As we pass the iron and steel works, with Top Lock to our left, we approach another vast tip called the Wootchie. The chimney in front of us belongs to the Albion Iron Works, which sat at the top of the canal as it made a 90-degree turn towards New Springs. At the top of our climb, we pass under Withington Lane and turn 90 degrees, and in the distance behind the Wootchie we can see the Marsh House Coke Works, just below Aspel. Ahead and to the left is Woodfield Street, a row of Victorian-built houses that in 1900 lived 3 generations of my father's family. This is the part of the line that really got me interested in the Springs branch in the first place. In the 1881 Worrell Guide, it stated that my great-grandfather was a builder-joiner and sawmill proprietor on Woodfield Street, whilst my great-great-grandfather, again living in the same street, was manager at Wigan Coal and Iron Company's sawmill. The original line finished just before we crossed the road. As we cross Wigan Road, we look up towards Aspel and we see the Collier Arms pub, which still stands today. After the crossing, we quickly pass the sawmills, which I have always assumed is where my great-great-grandfather was working. Passing the sawmills, in the distance we can see 2 more relatively small pits appearing in front of us. The first is Bridge Pit, whilst the one in the distance is Dairy Pit. The scenery here is much more rural as we pass over the canal, with the Hague Upper and Lower plantations hiding Hague Hall about a mile to the northwest. Crossing over Shedfield Bridge, we are in for a quick run down to the 2 collieries in the distance. Lindsay Pit is on the left and Alexandra Pit is on the right. At its peak, the Alexandra Pit employed more than 650 workers, whilst the Lindsay Pit more than 350. From this point, there was connection to the Welly Loop line at Bottling Wood, and therefore access to the vast network of lines to market. So we end our journey back in time. I hope you enjoyed it. I am sure in 2,000 years' time archaeologists will be excavating the area and declaring they have found what was once the centre of industrial civilization.